I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the couch and laughingly tell me I was on candid camera. I'd have said Jerry Springer, except in his case I'd have been lured to his studio under a false pretense. It had to be a joke. It was too surreal, too bizarre, too warped to be true. I longed for it to all be one huge joke, bad taste and ill-conceived, but a joke nonetheless. But it wasn't. It wasn't because there was Marcy following me around, babbling on with every sentence containing the word sorry. What was Marcy sorry for? It will probably take me a lifetime to decipher it all, but the gist of it all I will try to share as best I can. Marcy and I being Daniel Goodwin, weren't babes in the woods when we met. We weren't childhood sweethearts. Hell, we weren't even young, up-and-coming 20-something-year-olds. We were comfortable in our skin 30-somethings. So, I guess, no naivety excuse for me. We were both, however, first-timers. Neither of us had been married before. I had come close once, back in the days when I was young, innocent, and ruled by my small head. Marcy had once been in a short-lived de facto relationship back in college. We met through our respective careers. I was the manager of a small but lucrative mine, and she was the consultant hired to conduct personality tests on our workforce. Perhaps her expertise in reading people is what made her think she could get away with what she did. More on that later. I can still picture her sitting opposite me in my office, explaining how she intended to conduct the testing. I found it hard to concentrate on her words. It was totally unprofessional of me, but there was something about her that took my breath away, took my common sense away, took all sense away. It wasn't that she was Helen of Troy incarnate. Some might say she was too tall, too slender. Many men might have said her nose was a tad too long, her mouth a touch too wide. The same could be said of Julia Roberts, who was considered one of the world's most beautiful women. To this or to that didn't matter. For me, Marcy was all too perfect. As it happened, the attraction was mutual, something I'd always been grateful for until recently. I have no illusions about my rating on the handsome scale. My mother, God love her, always said I had an interesting rather than a purely handsome face, and, according to her, interesting was better. So I wasn't a George Clooney, more a David Strathairn. What I did have, however, was a keen intellect and a good sense of humor, though I hadn't been laughing much lately. Throughout the testing period, Marcy flirted, and I responded, but I waited, impatiently, until her contract was complete before calling and asking her out on a date. I put a lot of thought into that date. In the end, I took her on a picnic by a pebbled stream, and after enjoying pâté and brie with sliced apples, grapes, and cherries, I taught her how to pan for sapphires. She found the one I planted in her pan, and I can still recall the look of wonder and excitement on her face. She trusted me with her gem, and I had it cut and set for her in a pendant she still wore right up until the day she ripped my heart out. Dating rapidly became an engagement. Betrothed, such an old-fashioned word. Pity it didn't come with old-fashioned values. Our engagement was brief, and within 12 months of meeting we were married. The bliss of those early years has only deepened the pain of recent times. How could we, and I sincerely believed it was a we, have been so happy only to end up here? How could it all have gone so pear-shaped? How did excitedly house-hunting, laughing and loving as we painted and renovated to create our dream home, turn into my current nightmare? How? The beginning of the end started innocently enough, with a knock at the door. Marcy returned to the kitchen, where we'd been sitting at the table, sharing our traditional Sunday coffee and paper. How I enjoyed that simple ritual. She was pale, shaken. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, fearing one of our parents had been involved in a fatal accident. Why else would she be so upset by a knock at the door? Daniel, Julian has found me." I spilled my coffee. I knew who Julian was. He was her first flush of love confession, the love child conceived with her childhood sweetheart. Both being only 17, The families decided that the best option for all concerned was to put the baby up for adoption. Marcy named him and handed him over to a young, childless couple. Every now and then, with 1 or 2 extra wines under her belt, she'd wonder where he was and what he was doing. What? How? I don't know. He's in the living room. I rose and followed her. There, seated on our lounge, was a young man. All I could see was the back of his head. His hair was dark and kinked up at the ends. It seemed he'd inherited Marcy's waves. Marcy clutched my hand, squeezing my knuckles almost painfully. She led me around the lounge until we stood facing Julian, who rose and extended his hand. I tried to control my reaction, but I couldn't help the questioning glance I sent Marcy's way. She'd never mentioned that Jay, her childhood sweetheart, was Indian or Pakistani. It might explain why both sets of grandparents thought it best to have the baby put up for adoption. "Hello, Mr. Goodwin. I apologize for just landing on your doorstep like this. I didn't know what else to do." I nodded, extending my hand and gripping his firmly. "Hello, Julian. Please call me Daniel." Julian smiled. "Thank you. I have been searching for my mother for such a long time. I just arrived in town. I know I should have organized somewhere to stay and made contact in a less, surprising way. But I've been dreaming of this moment for so long I couldn't wait another day." Julian's English was excellent, with a sing-song accent that I was certain many young ladies found pleasing. I studied him, searching for a glimpse of Marcy in his features. Other than his glossy dark hair, there was none. His father must have been quite good-looking. Julian reminded me of the actor who played the rival for the girl's affection in the second-best exotic Marigold Hotel movie. He had movie star good looks. Marcy squeezed my hand even tighter. "You can stay here," she said, turning to me. "Can't he, Daniel?" What could I say? Not much without looking like an asshole. By the end of the day, Julian was settled in our guest bedroom, and Marcy was all aflutter. Never, not even in our early days, had I seen her so excited. She was visibly trembling. To be honest, I wasn't keen on having Julian under our roof, but I wanted to support Marcy. I knew she had doubts and guilt over going along with her parents' decision all those years ago. If having Julian here for a time helped her, I would swallow my reservations. In the subsequent months, I tried not to resent Julian's intrusion into our lives. The way our little rituals were changed or discarded to accommodate his presence. No more sharing a glass of wine while we prepared dinner side by side. No more leisurely Sunday mornings spent in bed before sharing a coffee and a paper, doing the crossword together. No more Saturdays spent wandering the markets or browsing antique shops. No more drives to the mountains for a hike. Even our weekday messaging dwindled to almost nothing. And then there were the new traditions. Now it was Marcy and Julian cooking meals together, mostly curries. As much as I enjoyed Indian cuisine, having it almost every night wore thin. If I wanted something like a steak, I had to prearrange it with Marcy so she and Julian could go out for the evening. As Julian was raised Hindu and my eating of beef was offensive to him, it became the pair of them going on weekend outings. Though nothing outright was said, it was clear they preferred I didn't tag along. Apparently, I would find museums and galleries boring. Evenings were spent watching them, with their heads bent toward each other in conversation and shared jokes, witnessing their hugs, which always seemed to go on a tad too long, or listening to the irritating way he, as a grown man, called her mummy, like a small boy. I felt like the third wheel in my marriage, an intruder in my own home. I tried to stem the flow. I asked her out on dates, surprised her with flowers. The list goes on. Her lack of reciprocation hurt. I can't deny it. Bit by bit, my wife was slipping away from me, and all the while I felt like my hands were tied, my tongue sheathed. I couldn't say anything without sounding like an unsupportive, selfish, insecure, jealous prick. I found Julian various jobs, none of which, for one reason or another, were suitable. I sent him and Marcy links to apartments for rent, and even offered to pay his rent until he was settled. Yet, Nothing came of any of the leads or my offer. My frustration grew, and my resentment right alongside it. Our previously wonderful sex life dwindled to almost nothing. Quick, late-night encounters purely for physical relief replaced our intimacy and lovemaking. Gone were the sensuality and experimenting. My wife and my marriage were disappearing before my eyes. The months dragged on, and with each passing day, my happiness eroded a little more. I was lonely, living in a house with 2 other people. I might as well have lived alone for all the effort Marcy and Julian made to include me. If Marcy saw my pain and bewilderment, she ignored it. She certainly avoided being alone with me for any length of time, likely to preempt my confronting her. Marcy scaled back her contract work, leaving her only financial contribution to our household as her part-time college lecturing income. So not only was I being excluded, but I was also being asked to fund the exclusion. I felt like I was only kept around to pay for their lifestyle. He was the reason for her loss of interest in her career, in me, in our life together, and I resented him for it. In time, I came to resent her too. The final straw was when their actions began to affect my work. I was responsible for the lives of 160 men, their livelihood, their well-being, their safety. The decisions I made could be deadly if poorly executed. On the spur of the moment, I decided to take a week off. I needed to get my head together and have a serious conversation with Marcy. No more pussyfooting around. Things had to change. I wouldn't continue the way I had been. I organized my time off on Thursday and went in for a half day on Friday to tie up a few loose ends. On my way home, I stopped to buy flowers and wine. I planned to steal Marcy away from Julian for the evening and take her to one of our favorite restaurants, a small French bistro. Perhaps, away from our home and Julian, she would not only hear my words, but also listen. And as a bonus, I'd get a steak cooked to perfection. I was bolstered by my choice, quietly optimistic that my composed and logical arguments might finally penetrate the emotional distance my wife had maintained for the past 9 months. Entering the house, I juggled a bouquet of flowers and my briefcase. All was serene, save for the faint strains of Indian sitar music wafting from upstairs, likely emanating from Julian's room. Setting down my belongings, I ascended the stairs to our bedroom, intending to freshen up after a long day at work. The door was ajar, and the unfamiliar music gave me pause. Stepping inside, I was confronted with a scene that defied comprehension. It couldn't be real. My initial reaction was one of self-reproach, questioning why such a grotesque image would manifest in my mind. What kind of man was I to harbor such disturbing thoughts subconsciously? The ground beneath me seemed to sway and spin, inducing a sensation of vertigo. I gasped, though the music masked the sound, much like it concealed their murmurs, and the soft rustle of sheets as they moved together. Their sinuous motions continued unabated as I stood frozen, unable to move, my stomach churning with revulsion, my throat constricting as I fought to contain the bile rising within me. Her pendant, the one crafted especially for her, swung back and forth like a pendulum. I desperately wanted to avert my gaze, to look away from the horror unfolding before me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It seemed to serve as both a reminder of our connection and an anchor preventing me from succumbing to the chaos enveloping my world. It felt like watching an imminent car crash where tragedy was inevitable. You want to turn away, but the impending collision exerts an irresistible pull. My beloved wife, the woman I cherished, revealed herself as sick and twisted, depraved. Marcy, what have you done? My heart shattered into a million pieces. Despite my growing disdain for Julian, what Marcy had allowed to occur, regardless of who initiated it, was fundamentally wrong. She, as the mature adult, had a responsibility. He was barely 20, still naive and impressionable. Marcy, with her understanding of human nature, possessed the capability to manipulate him. I knew I had to take action. But what? Call the authorities? They would require evidence. Trembling, I reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone. My hands shook uncontrollably. It took me several attempts to unlock it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and began recording. They remained oblivious to my presence. Seeing them on the screen of my phone only intensified the disgust. It felt like witnessing a repulsive scene from a pornographic film. More bile surged into my throat, burning with indignation. I reached my limit. Tucking my phone away, I turned and descended the stairs, heading for the solace of the kitchen. And grabbing a tea towel, I dampened it and pressed it against the back of my neck, finding relief in its coolness. Leaving it draped over my shoulders, I filled a glass with water, gulping it down to wash away the bitter taste in my mouth before spitting it into the sink. With legs trembling, I settled into a seat at the kitchen table, retrieving my phone once more. My call to the police was brief. Hopefully they wouldn't delay in arriving. Parental de URL. The sitar music drifting downstairs grated on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Each note felt like torture. I longed to escape the nightmare my home had become. The sound of car doors opening and closing alerted me to the police's arrival. Making my way slowly to the front door, every step felt agonizingly slow. 2 officers, one male and one female, stood framed in the doorway. Without a word, I gestured towards the stairs. They advanced cautiously, batons at the ready, silently ascending. As the strumming of sitars ceased, replaced by screams, my heart clenched. The thuds and scuffles echoed through the house, each sound causing me to flinch involuntarily. Then silence fell like a heavy curtain. No music, no thuds, no cries, only the murmur of muted voices. My gaze fixed on the landing above. The male officer emerged first, leading a handcuffed Julian, clad only in boxers. Marcy, escorted by the female officer, followed closely behind. My throat tightened. Marcy, too, wore handcuffs, her favorite dressing gown cinched tightly around her waist. Though she hung her head, the pallor of her face and the lingering flush of passion on her exposed chest spoke volumes. Marcy's eyes met mine, and I knew my horror and disgust were unmistakable. "He's not my son!" she cried out, each step punctuated by the same desperate refrain. "He's not my son. He's not my son." Her words released me, and I turned away, retreating back to the kitchen, her anguished cries echoing in my ears. "You'll have the opportunity to prove that, Mrs. Goodwin, down at the station." The officer's voice followed me. Hovering near the table, uncertainty gripped me. The male officer returned, introducing himself as Officer Kaplan. "Mr. Goodwin, are you able to provide the video you mentioned? It's crucial evidence," he asked. For the third time in less than an hour, I retrieved my phone from my pocket, forwarding Officer Kaplan the damning clip of Marcy and Julian's illicit encounter. "Daniel, may I call you Daniel?" Officer Kaplan asked. At my nod, he continued, concern etched in his features. "Daniel, you're probably in shock. Is there anyone I can call for you?" "No, I'll be all right. I just need time to think, to wrap my head around this. I had no idea until I walked in on it." Kaplan reached into his shirt pocket and handed me a card. "That's got my cell number on the back. I'll be in touch as we may need to gather evidence for prosecution. Can you stay elsewhere for a few days?" "Yes, I can't stay here, not now. I'll book myself into a hotel. Keep your phone with you, if you don't mind. We may need to ask you some questions." "Okay." With that, he left, leaving me alone in the now eerily quiet house. The silence seemed to press in on me, suffocating. I needed to get away. Glancing towards the stairs, dread gripped my stomach. I'd have to go up there to pack a few essentials. Clothes could be replaced, but the haunting images of Marcy's betrayal, imprinted in my mind, couldn't. I didn't want to confront the aftermath of her actions amidst the disarray of sheets and discarded clothing. I had enough to contend with already. Grabbing my keys and briefcase, I walked out the front door, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere within. Within minutes of gripping the steering wheel, I realized it was a mistake. I was a potential hazard on the road. Pulling over, my parking job was sloppy, but that was the least of my worries. Luckily, I found myself parked just a few doors down from a bustling coffee shop. Despite the crowd, I managed to secure a table tucked away in the back corner. I wasn't hungry or thirsty, but I knew I needed to order something to justify occupying the space. Opting for a coffee and a slice of chocolate cake, I vaguely recalled reading somewhere that chocolate was beneficial in times of shock. And shock was an understatement. I was shaken to my core. My mind resembled a chaotic pinball machine, thoughts bouncing around uncontrollably. Each thought propelled the ball in a different direction, none of them coherent. As my order arrived, I forced myself to take a deep breath. Eating and drinking felt like a foreign concept, as if I were learning the basics all over again. I had to consciously instruct myself. Lift cup to mouth, take a sip, swallow, use spoon to cut cake, scoop up, place in mouth, chew, swallow, repeat. The ritual provided a semblance of control amid the turmoil of my thoughts. Marcy's revelation hit me like a freight train. A sexual affair? With her own son? Or perhaps not? Were her cries of, "He's not my son," truth, or just another layer of deception? Regardless, she had welcomed her lover into our home, carrying on under the roof I provided, right under my nose. Lies. Too many lies. Months upon months of deceit and betrayal. The audacity of it left me breathless. I struggled to comprehend the enormity of her deception. I felt nauseated, but for an entirely different reason. I had been a fool, utterly foolish and naive. I hadn't dared to question. Was he truly her son? I had never noticed the lack of resemblance, never questioned Julian's unmistakable Indian heritage. Blindly, I had believed. Removing the veil of their supposed familial bond, their interaction suddenly seemed painfully obvious. Those lingering hugs, the subtle touches. I had been a trusting fool. Oh, how they must have chuckled at my expense. I felt used. Marcy had exploited my love for her in every conceivable way. Emotionally, mentally, physically, and financially. How had I failed to see the darkness within her? How had she concealed her true nature from me for almost 6 years? From the moment she walked into my office until now. Never in a million years had I imagined her capable of such wickedness. I raised the empty coffee cup to my lips, surprised by its emptiness. Glancing down at the plate, I found only a few crumbs remaining of the chocolate cake. Carefully, I set the cup back on the table, feeling adrift. The absence of something to occupy my hands momentarily threw me off balance. Think, Daniel, if a friend were in your shoes, what advice would you give? The answer struck me like lightning. Protect yourself. Marcy had revealed her true nature, and it was time for me to take heed. She was a parasite, a master manipulator, devoid of morality or ethics, ruthless, perhaps even a sociopath or worse. She had already thrown me under the bus. It was time for me to prioritize my own well-being. Scanning the street, I spotted what I needed, a branch of my bank. Serendipitously, another bank stood just 2 doors down. They were about to gain a new customer. Initially, I debated withdrawing only half the funds, but then I recalled how I had unknowingly supported their depravity for months. In the end, I left her with $10, solely due to the account's joint nature, fearing I might need her signature to close it. My thoughts then turned to credit cards. While I rarely used mine, Marcy tended to accumulate significant balances each month, paid in full from our joint account. Her university salary, deposited a week before the credit card due date, often fell short of covering her expenses. I refused to be liable for the difference. She had already taken enough from me. As I waited for my new accounts to be opened, a solution emerged. I needed to make a public declaration. Marcy and I were officially separated, effective immediately, and I would not be held responsible for any debts she incurred. It might not hold up legally, but it was worth a shot. Exiting the bank, I checked my watch, hoping to place the advertisement online in time for it to appear in the next day's edition. Thankfully, I had grabbed my briefcase on my way out of the house. Fortune smiled upon me. After placing the public notice, I began researching lawyers, securing an appointment for the following Monday. This gave me the weekend to gather all the necessary information and paperwork. Next on my agenda was a real estate agent. I needed an appraisal of the house. Yesterday it had been my dream home. Today it was a house of horrors. If Marcy didn't end up in jail, she could buy me out, or we'd have to sell. I had no intention of remaining there. A quick Google search revealed 3 agents on the main street. Spotting one out of the car window, I felt relieved. Surely one of them could meet me there over the weekend. Tom Harris, from one agent, agreed to meet me the following morning at what I now considered my former home. With these immediate protective measures in place, I felt a semblance of calm return. I was somewhat back in control, though utterly exhausted. I drove to the Sheraton, where visiting board members typically stayed. I knew they had upscale retail shops, along with a restaurant and bar on the lower level. While it would be expensive to outfit myself for the next few days, I simply didn't have the energy to visit multiple stores. After fumbling with the electronic key card for the 3rd time, oh, how I missed traditional keys, I finally gained access to my room. I made a beeline for the bed, tossing my purchases onto it. As I undressed, I shook my head in disbelief. Who in their right mind thought it was acceptable to charge over $50 for a single pair of boxer briefs? They must be gold-plated. Naked, I strode into the bathroom, hoping a hot shower would cleanse away the haunting images of Marcy entwined with her son on our bed. I wished to wash away not just the events of the day, but the torment of the past 9 months. Sadly, despite having all my protective measures in place, my ability to shut down the emotional side of my brain faltered. The images of Marcy and Julian, their bodies moving together, her pendant swaying between her breasts, refused to dissipate like sweat. The pain and revulsion were visceral, almost tangible. I wondered if the crushing weight in my chest was a heart attack. It certainly felt like it. Part of me wished it were true. Anything, even death, seemed preferable to the agony I was enduring. Leaning against the shower wall, I prayed for some truth in the old adage that time heals all wounds. I ordered room service, opting for a steak. Despite its perfect preparation, it tasted like sawdust. Damn her to hell. Crawling beneath the covers, still cursing Marcy, I found solace only in my emotional exhaustion. Both my body and mind surrendered to sleep as soon as my head touched the pillow. I didn't know what to expect when I walked into the house on Saturday morning, but it certainly wasn't Marcy, clad in a flimsy, negligee-style dressing gown that left little to the imagination, holding a glass of wine. She had evidently made bail quickly. Tom's eyes nearly bulged out of their sockets at the sight of her barely concealed breasts. "Daniel, we need to talk," she slurred, her gaze shifting between Tom and me in confusion. It was clear that the wine in her hand wasn't her first, and it wasn't even midday. "Oh, I'd say you pretty much said it all yesterday, Marcy. A picture paints 1,000 words and all that," I retorted. I turned to Tom. "So this is, as you can see, the front entryway. If you follow me, I can show you the kitchen. It's new, only just over a year old." Tom looked uncomfortable, but moved past Marcy to follow me. "The countertops are quartz. The splashbacks are glass. There's a walk-in pantry." "Daniel, what are you doing?" Marcy interrupted. Without turning, I replied, "Giving Tom the grand tour so he can provide an appraisal." "An appraisal? For what?" she asked incredulously. "For the house, of course," I replied. "But we're not selling," Marcy interjected. Would you like me to come back another time, Daniel?" Tom asked, sensing the tension. "Would you like some time to sort things out with your wife?" "No, not necessary, Tom," I responded firmly, turning to Marcy. "You may not want to sell, but I do. So you can either buy me out or we can put the house on the market. Either way, we need an appraisal." Yes, as we moved from room to room, I pointed out features while Tom took notes and photos. Marcy trailed behind us, alternating between whimpering and attempting to interrupt. I talked over her attempts, and Tom did his best to ignore her. I felt for the guy, but once the sale went through, his commission would make up for any current discomfort. As I saw Tom out, he assured me he would work out the appraisal overnight and contact me the next day. Excellent. One more task completed in the separation of my life from Marcy's. Closing the door, I turned, nearly colliding with Marcy. She reached out to steady herself, grabbing my arm, and a nauseating mixture of sour wine and perfume assaulted my senses. My skin crawled at her touch. "Daniel, please, let's talk about this," Marcy pleaded. "Like I said earlier, there's nothing to talk about," I replied firmly. "Please, Daniel, let me explain," she insisted. I stared hard at her. "Will explaining make you feel better?" "Yes," she replied earnestly. "Well, Marcy, after the perversion I witnessed yesterday, the culmination of 9 months of deceit and betrayal after betrayal, I have no interest whatsoever in doing anything to make you feel better." "Daniel, you're rushing into a decision you may regret," she cautioned. I laughed derisively. "What would I regret exactly, Marcy? Walking in on you loving your son?" "He's not my son," she protested. "Says you, the liar, the backstabbing cheat. So what would I regret? Being lied to, being betrayed, maybe being used, being made a fool of. Which one would I regret?" I challenged. Losing my love. You would miss me." "We're good together," she pleaded. "Losing your love? Oh, I think it's clear I lost that nearly a year ago. I was just too trusting to realize. Hell, that's presuming I ever truly had your love in the first place. And Marcy, you've been absent in all the ways that count for months now, so adding your physical absence to the list would hardly cause a ripple," I retorted, my tone laced with bitterness. "I do love you, Daniel. Truly I do. This thing with Julian took me by surprise. Blindsided me, you might say. He was in my class. There was something about him. I just felt this instant connection. I got, swept off my feet, a little obsessed." Marcy's voice trembled with desperation. "Instant connection? Blindsided? A little obsessed? Marcy, you moved him in, flaunted your affection, spent intimate time with him in our bed, told me he was your son. You told my parents the same. For all I know, he really is your son, and you're a depraved bitch." "A sick deviant," I spat out, my anger boiling over. "No, no, no," she moaned, shaking her head frantically. "You can't really believe that. I am sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "Yes, your actions say that loud and clear," I replied, sarcasm lacing each word. "It's true. You have to believe me," she pleaded desperately. "No, I don't, Marcy. I don't have to believe a single word out of your mouth ever again. You gave up your right to my blind belief the day the first lie to me passed your lips," I declared, my voice cold and unforgiving. "I don't want a divorce," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I didn't want a depraved pervert, a backstabbing, lying, using, cheating bitch for a wife. Guess we both lucked out," I retorted bitterly. "Daniel, please, I've told you, he's not my son. I am so sorry. Please, let me explain," Marcy pleaded, desperation evident in her voice. "Your reasons are of no interest to me, Marcy. Your actions say enough to fill an entire bookshelf," I replied firmly, realizing the truth in my words. I had done nothing to deserve her betrayal. "And nothing you say will make me look at you or think of you with anything other than disgust, with revulsion." "But you love me. You can't have just switched it off like a tap," she wailed. "The Marcy I loved died nearly a year ago. That's if she ever existed. Maybe she was a character you played. Maybe she wasn't real. Maybe you were an illusion. More fool me. But don't worry, Marcy. I've learned my lesson," I concluded, my tone resolute. Stepping around her, I ascended the stairs, wrinkling my nose at what seemed like the lingering scent of their illicit encounters in the master bedroom. Retrieving a suitcase from the walk-in robe, I placed it on the floor with a deliberate distance from the disheveled bed. I had no intention of contaminating my belongings with Marcy and Julian's filth. Methodically, I filled the suitcase, then retrieved a second, and eventually a small carry-on. Room by room, I gathered my possessions, leaving no room for sentimentality or foolishness. If I liked it, it went with me. If nothing else, it could be sold later. By the time I finished, I had more boxes and cases than my car could accommodate, so I called my father and asked him to bring his trailer. As always, he understood without needing explanations, saving his questions for another time. Throughout the process, Marcy trailed after me, attempting to engage in conversation, perhaps hoping her pleas or tears would sway me. They didn't. Instead, they reinforced my resolve. They were just more lies, more deceit, more manipulations. As for Julian, I had no idea where he was, and frankly, I didn't care. I heard the sound of my father's car and turned to Marcy. "If you say so much as one word to my father, I will tell him how I came home to find you loving your son." Marcy didn't acknowledge my words. "Do you hear me?" Marcy nodded, flinching at the menace in my tone. I opened the front door. My father looked at me and then over my shoulder at Marcy before returning his gaze to me. From his expression, I knew he'd correctly assessed the situation. "Right then, what do you need moved? I brought my trolley in case any of it's large," he said, ever practical. I smiled and silently thanked God for my father's practicality. He took his cue from me and ignored Marcy while we worked together. It was quite a feat as she followed us from room to room, sobbing and looking bedraggled. We worked almost silently, directing each other with nods and hand signals. I felt as if I had a force field surrounding me, and Marcy's cries bounced off my shield. Who knew how long my protection would last? Hopefully long enough for me to put some distance between myself and my current situation. With the last of the load stowed, my father laid his hand on my shoulder. "Follow me, son." I nodded, feeling the weight of the past 24 hours beginning to catch up with me. The drive was a blur. When we stopped, I saw we were parked in front of a storage facility not far from my parents' house. I slumped against the wheel, realizing that throughout all the packing, I hadn't given a thought as to what I was going to do with all the gear. We went inside, and I let Dad take the lead and handle the paperwork. I was exhausted. The attendant placed a map on the counter and using a red pen marked a spot. He handed over some keys. I blindly followed my father. We unpacked everything except my suitcases and the carry-on. "Meet you at the house, Dan," my father said. I nodded. 10 minutes later, I found myself seated in my parents' kitchen, my mother pushing a cup of coffee toward me. "We're here when you're ready to explain," my mother said quietly, her voice gentle, like the voice of my childhood. That was all it took. My force field shattered and I broke down, sobbing like a child. My mother held me while my father patted my shoulder. The whole hideous story came out in a garbled mess, my words punctuated by gasps and cries of horror from my parents. "Her son? No, no, no. Oh, God, surely not," Mum moaned, shaking her head. Perhaps my words had put the images in my head into hers, too. She'd liked and cared for Marcy from their first meeting. "She says he's not her son. I don't know what to believe, Mum," I admitted. "What are you going to do?" asked my father. "I called the police. I assume they're investigating. To be honest, I was surprised she was at the house today. I thought she'd be in jail." "Divorce?" my mother whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "You'd best protect yourself, Dan. After what she's already done, you can't know what other depths she's willing to plumb. You don't want her to run off with all your savings," my father advised. "Already done, Dad," I replied, a sense of determination in my voice. We talked some more. Mum insisted I stay with them until I could find a house or apartment to rent. That was a relief. I didn't want to be alone. Alone, a state I supposed I'd have to get used to. A vision of my future stretched before me. It looked like a long, lonely, barren landscape. Damn Marcy. Damn her to hell. That night, as I lay there in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, unable to sleep, I remembered the lines from a book I'd read what felt like 100 years earlier. I couldn't recall the exact words, but the gist of them was that when something in your life went pear-shaped, things like bad news, a death, a spouse's betrayal, it felt like sustaining a blow to the gut, like being winded. Bullshit. Utter bullshit. That was like saying being shot at close range was on a par with a mosquito bite. My mind replayed the horror of seeing Marcy sinuously moving with her son, her lover, in the bed she had shared with me. I could remember the moment as clearly as if I were still in it. I could still hear the sitar and the rustle of the sheets. I could still smell a waft of Marcy's perfume and hear my gasp of shock, feel the thunder of my heart, the tight band of compression around my chest. No amount of effort would stop my mind from making me relive the moment over and over again. It was a scab my brain just had to pick. What I felt as wave after wave of horror and disgust washed through me as violently as it had when I'd stood in the doorway seeing it for the first time was so much worse than losing breath by being punched in the solar plexus. The closest I could come to describing it accurately would be to say it resembled having someone attach a high-powered vacuum cleaner over my heart and sucking the very life out of me. Everything. All the things that made me, me. Intangible things that had absolutely no physical substance, the way my height or the breadth of my shoulders did, and yet were so much more important in defining who I was. Well, things like my thoughts and feelings, my memories and experiences, gone, all gone, gone. A pathetic word, so inadequate. I was an empty vessel. What filled the void wasn't good and kind and caring. It was anger and hatred. I didn't fight it. It felt good to have them take over. Better than opening the floodgate to doubt. Better than succumbing to despair. Better than collapsing under the weight of the loss of my dreams. And most certainly, better than the unbearable pain trying to beat down my door and cripple me. The hatred swamping my empty gut was a tangible thing, as real as the bed I lay on. It filled me to overflowing, oozing out of me like a thick, destructive river of corrosive poison. I made no effort to stem its flow or disguise its vileness. It felt good to let it see the light of day with no mask disguising its ugliness. Somewhere deep inside, I registered anxiety, but I didn't care. I knew my mother would hardly recognize the man sleeping in her son's room. I hardly recognized him. The road to divorce was long and hard. The press reported the possible incest. That made the front page. Their retraction a week later on page 20. A tiny note easily missed. Marcy was notorious, me to a much lesser degree. It cost Marcy her position at the university and me money, as the courts ruled. I had to support Marcy until our divorce was settled, something else for my monster to loathe her for. As if the publicity wasn't bad enough, Marcy fought the divorce every step of the way. I endured endless negotiations seated opposite her in the conference room of either her legal counsel or mine. Negotiations where I stared at her, mentally seeing my hand reach across the table, turning into a claw that broke through her chest cavity and ripped out her heart. I waded through reams of legal jargon, seeing the words in red written in blood. Marcy's blood. Worst of all, I sat through hours of court-mandated counseling sessions where Marcy wore her damned pendant, and I had to pretend I didn't want to wrap my hands around her throat and squeeze the breath out of her. Sessions where she reassured me again and again Julian wasn't her son. She'd emailed me the proof and shoved hard copies into my hand at the first session. Like the only thing holding me back from reconciling with her was proof that Julian's DNA differed from hers. Nothing I said. Nothing my lawyer said. Hell, not even the gentle questions of the marriage counselor, designed to lead Marcy to understand the level of her betrayal, penetrated Marcy's defenses. With every delay, every obstacle she put in my way, she fed the monster residing in my gut, the monster who was biding his time before exacting his revenge. Through his eyes not blinkered by rose-colored glasses, I saw the depth of her selfishness. Had she truly loved me, she'd have let me go, wanting my happiness above all else. That's what I would have done for her had she come to me when she first fell in love. Lust? With Julian. It would have saddened me, absolutely gutted me. But her happiness had been of paramount importance to me back then, and so if her happiness lay with someone else, as difficult as it would have been, I'd have let her go. Had she done that, the monster would never have been born. Not so Marcy. From my personal one-on-one sessions with a therapist, also mandated by the courts, I came to understand Marcy needed my forgiveness. She needed my love to continue. She needed me to take her back and continue as if the last year and a half hadn't happened. Then and only then would she be able to live with herself. She needed me to help her erase her heinous deeds, her overwhelming guilt. She needed me to help her live in denial of her inner monster. I didn't give her what she needed. What I gave her was temptation. I found Julian, who, it turns out, was really Ravi Singh. Well, technically, one of my engineers found him. The guy was on the spectrum, and though he worked as an engineer, he didn't actually have the piece of paper saying he was qualified. 5 years earlier, I'd seen something in him and gave him a chance. I'd never regretted that decision. Quite the opposite. He was invaluable. I'd never met anyone who had a brain that worked like his. His social skills might suck, but his mind was razor sharp. He mastered software, wrote code, and came up with out-of-the-box solutions on a regular basis. And he was loyal to me. Between us, we investigated Julian, probably knew him as well as his family. We anonymously fed him information and led him back to Marcy. She, in her vanity, may not have realized the reason behind his interest, but I did. He wanted a shortcut to Australian residency. I gambled on the fact that he was running out of time before being sent back to India, and he'd already put months of effort into Marcy. Turns out she lied to him as well. She told him we were in a de facto relationship. Apparently, he'd been most upset to discover we were married. All that effort for nothing. Not so upset, though, that he wasn't prepared to take up with her again, give her another chance. And Marcy, ever remorseful and I love only you, Daniel, Marcy, didn't take a lot of convincing. Once all hope of our reconciliation was dashed and our divorce became final, it was only a matter of weeks before she started up with Julian again. Whatever the guy had in his trousers must be pretty potent stuff. My monster sneered. My ever-kind mother, seemingly seeking to ease my feelings of rejection, suggested that perhaps Marcy needed to delude herself into believing that she had acted out of a great love. A love larger than life itself. A love akin to that of Romeo and Juliet. A love that, in Marcy's perception, justified all the pain, betrayal, and breach of trust required for her and Julian to be together. Oh, what a load of nonsense. Of course I didn't voice that sentiment to my sweet, idealistic mother. As far as I was concerned, Marcy could indulge in all the self-deception she wanted. I knew the truth. My inner monster knew the truth. She was simply a disloyal, morally lax woman who found pleasure in being with a man young enough to be her son. The difference was, now it didn't bother me. In fact, now I was banking on it, and counting on Julian to intensify his efforts. He didn't disappoint. In a mere 3 months, he impregnated her. Shocking, isn't it? Marcy must have conveniently forgotten that persistent diarrhea and vomiting can interfere with the effectiveness of contraceptive pills. I couldn't help but wonder what culinary delights Julian had served her. Hopefully, another damn curry. Nothing could have brought me more satisfaction. Both her indiscretions and her subsequent pregnancy. Unsurprisingly, Julian utilized his conservative Indian upbringing to insist they marry. Not that I suspected Marcy put up much resistance. The vain woman would never question why a young, handsome man pursued a woman old enough to be his mother. When I shared the news with my father, he couldn't help but laugh. He saw through Marcy's vanity and foolishness as clearly as I did. In truth, it was my father who sparked the idea for my revenge. My inner monster craved something more drastic, more visceral. But even he recognized the wisdom in avoiding a lifetime behind bars. When a man steals your wife, there is no better revenge than to let him keep her, my father had said to me that fateful night when Marcy's betrayal was laid bare. It was the best advice he'd ever given me, and he'd given me plenty over the years. So there was Marcy, on the verge of turning 40, pregnant, and newly wedded to a man nearly 2 decades her junior. Both of them had played their parts just as I anticipated. My inner monster owed Marcy a debt of gratitude for her predictability, and now it was time to set my plan in motion. With the newlyweds off to the Whitsundays for a blissful 10 days, I found it remarkably easy to carry out my scheme. Their absence made it simple to sneak into their garage and discreetly place bags of fertilizer and aluminum powder, items I had meticulously collected from my mine over several months. I must admit I rather enjoy my job. Alongside these, I added cans of diesel oil and sacks of old nuts, bolts, and nails, the ingredients for a homemade bomb. Somewhat challenging for me, but not for my resourceful engineer, was to enroll Ravi as a paid member of a militant Hindu group advocating for the genocide of Muslims. Adding in some floor plans of the Lakemba Mosque, Australia's largest mosque, transformed him into a potential terrorist, awaiting only the addition of fertilizer. With everything in place, an anonymous tip-off to the federal police from a concerned citizen led to Julian's arrest upon his return from his honeymoon. Fortunately, they weren't as taken with him as my ex-wife had been. I shudder to think what I would have done if they had simply released him. Thankfully, I didn't have to face that dilemma. Once again, the infamous couple made the headlines. This time, however, Marcy didn't photograph so well. Pregnancy seemed to be taking its toll on her. I suppose having a child at 40 was more demanding on the body than during one's 20s or 30s. Months later, Ravi was deported back to India, with a note on his file ensuring he would never be granted entry to Australia again. And Marcy? Well, she relocated to the Northern Territory, Australia's equivalent of the Wild West, perhaps in an attempt to escape her notoriety. There, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. That was 5 years ago. These days, all I know of Marcy is that she's a 40-plus single mother raising a biracial child. Let's hope she's found a reliable form of contraception. She's unable to work in her chosen profession because her reputation is in ruins. Any potential employer or teaching position would require references, and hers would be less than stellar. Who would want to hire someone suspected of incest or being the wife of a terrorist? Beyond these assumptions, I have no idea how she or her child are faring, what kind of employment she's sought or found, whether she's stayed in Darwin or moved elsewhere. I'm completely in the dark about her whereabouts, and that's exactly how I and my inner monster prefer it. It turns out my inner monster has boundaries. It won't harm children. I couldn't inflict any further damage on Marcy without affecting her child, and that's a line I won't cross. My inner monster, my temporary insanity, has been dormant for quite some time now, and hopefully it stays that way forever. My wife, Cassie, our little miracle, and our energetic toddler have never had to experience his presence. It feels wonderful to have love, warmth, and kindness flowing through my veins once again. I'm at peace. Small joke for end. A man returns home a day early from a business trip well after midnight. On the way home, he strikes up a conversation with the cab driver and confides that he suspects his wife is cheating on him. He asks the cabbie to be a witness, offering $100 for his assistance. The cabbie agrees. Arriving home quietly, the husband and cabbie sneak into the bedroom. The husband flips on the lights and pulls back the blanket, revealing his wife in bed with another man. In a fit of rage, the husband pulls out a gun and points it at the naked man's head. The wife panics and blurts out, "Don't shoot! I lied about inheriting money. He's the one who bought you the Corvette, the cabin cruiser, the season tickets for the Panthers, the lake house, the country club membership, and he even covers the monthly bills." Stunned, the husband lowers the gun and turns to the cabbie, asking, "What would you do in my shoes?" Without missing a beat, the cabbie replies, "I'd make sure he doesn't catch a cold. Cover him up with that blanket."